Welcome back to the Kumeyaay channel. We are concluding our series of book review chapters on A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. This last chapter is the most important chapter. And if you haven't read all the other chapters, it probably won't make sense. But if you have read the previous chapters, this chapter will mean a lot to you. So let's get started. Well, first of all, let me say this. The reason why this is my last chapter in my series of chapter reviews is because I do not like the chapter 24 and chapter 25 for teaching. I teach modern American history, which is why we start at Reconstruction. And I just believe that if you want to go beyond this, it's probably better to get another book because I think Zinn did those last two chapters as an afterthought, and it really doesn't, you can tell when he updated his book, he did those other chapters. And I just feel like he probably wasn't at the top of his game when he wrote chapter 24 and chapter 25. That being said, I really like how Zinn was, what he was able to accomplish in such a short amount of time. How he stayed focused on his thesis was very impressive. So this chapter is the coming revolt of the guards. Now, let me start off with this. So first of all, the American political system, the American system is the prison. This system is based on capitalism and it's run by the rich. So the guards of the rich are the middle class and the poor are the ones in the prisons. So you have to understand those three components to understand, the middle class are guarding the poor for the rich. And he had hints of this in the robber barons chapter when he kind of introduced this understanding. So this idea of capitalism and modern finance is actually a relatively new idea. So the modern banking system was actually started in Italy with the nation states, for example, the Medici family. So that's kind of the beginning of capitalism as we know it, where you have venture capitalism, people, acquiring wealth. The first stock market was in the Dutch stock market, I believe in the 1700s or the 1600s. So basically what I'm saying is if you look at history as a world phenomenon, as a, broad scope all the way back to, the Bronze Age, businesses and entrepreneurs are kind of a new idea. Before that, for instance, the Roman Empire, you just had the two pillars of the establishment. You had military and politicians. And so with this new capitalistic system, you have the third pillar of the establishment introduced in world history, according to Zinn, which is business executives and corporate interests and entrepreneurs. So I just want to set that understanding. So what Zinn is arguing largely is a very Marxian thing, Marxian idea. And if you haven't read Karl Marx, you probably don't understand, you're not making the connection. But if you had read Karl Marx, this is immediately going to be apparent to you. So another way to understand the middle class is the petite bourgeoisie. So in Marxian theory, you have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The proletariat are the working class. The bourgeoisie are the ones that own everything, own the machines, own the factories. So there's this understanding, if you read the Communist Manifesto, where he says it's from the petite bourgeoisie, that's where the revolt will happen, because eventually they're going to be left out of the system and they're going to basically revolt against the bourgeoisie because they're not really in the club, although they kind of are. So it's hard to understand, but so I'm kind of throwing it like a lot at you. Take what you can. And so you have to understand if you want to go further, understand what Karl Marx was saying. So here's the bias in this book, and he states it in quotes, and I quote, "It is a history disrespectful of government and respectful of people's movements of resistance." That's really what the point of this book was. So it's the opposite of most history books, and this is why I use it for my course, because it emphasized, most history books emphasize the savior complex, or someone is to save you For example, the revolutionary crisis was the founding fathers, were the saviors. The slavery crisis, Lincoln is the savior. President Lincoln is the savior. During the Great Depression, it's FDR, Roosevelt is the savior. And if you compare and contrast the chapter on the New Deal and the Depression, Zinn labels it self-help in hard times. So what he's saying is turning that on its head, saying you have to help yourself. Here's examples of how people help themselves. And the reason why, and then I'll carry with that thread later on. Yeah, so the reason why he does that, or the reason why Zinn disagrees with that idea of most textbooks of the savior idea, is it surrenders our own strength and it demeans our own ability, meaning the 99%. So the way the narrative, the history is written, it's disempowering to the average person because you're always counting on a savior to come save you. So history is written with that type of narrative. So all history is bias, basically. And one of the things I like is, and you know, I kind of wish Zinn stated this earlier in the way he did it here, because this is one of the themes throughout the book is, and he states the 99 are fed just enough scraps that they forget who the real enemy is. So, you know, the 99% fight each other instead of the 1% who are responsible for that system. For example, the small property owner fights the propertyless. The black person fights the white person. The native born fights the foreign born, xenophobia. Intellectuals and professionals fight the uneducated and unskilled. And so the bias of Zinn is he's taking the liberty or attempting to unite those 99% as one people. So race is a big issue in America. And so instead of focusing on race, focus on your class, and that being in solidarity, you understand that you are in it together. That's how Zinn would argue. So, and this would ultimately to declare deep enmity of interest with the 1%. So wealthy elites have the biggest fear of the wealthy elites. Now, there was a letter that was released by Citibank talking about plutocracy recently. And one thing this letter said by Citibank is the biggest fear of the elite and the wealthy is if the 99% unify, and because we are in a democracy, we could vote against their wishes. So this is kind of what Zinn is talking about. The wealthy elite's biggest fear is something that the founding fathers tried to prevent all the way up until now. So we talked about earlier, I don't know if I talked about it enough or very well, but Samuel Huntington talked about it, an excessive democracy. Basically, too much democracy is a bad thing because you don't want to give the masses too much power, which is why we actually live in a republic, not a democracy. That's one of the things the founding fathers, why they set that up. It wasn't a pure democracy because ultimately they didn't want that. So, and then so James Madison feared the majority faction, which is that excessive democracy or too much democracy, and hoped we the people, this like kind of semantics, would ensure domestic tranquility through myth. And so capitalism ultimately, like I said in the beginning, capitalism is a new idea. It really came out of the industrial age, and it started with venture capital investments in Europe. But at this time, during the industrial age, especially in America, you have capitalism really coming to what we see today, materializing. And with this consolidation of capital was through industry and government. So for example, after the Reconstruction, you have the Southern and Northern elites develop a new coalition. And at this point in time, you have the lower class, black and white, become occupied in racial conflict. You also at this point have native workers and immigrant workers clashing in the North, and you have farmers dispersing. But there did come rebellion, and this is one of Zinn's important points, is that during the 30s, he marks it as one of the most important times in America, in the people's history of America, for people demonstrating and realizing their actual power in this political system. So this rebellion came from industrial workers and farmers. Now, I want to mention at this point, I talked about it in the last chapter review. Zinn's weakest, perhaps the weakest point of his book is he doesn't include Mexican American history. Now, if you want to talk about farmers organizing, you have to talk about Mexican American history a lot more, Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers of America. So that's to get the full picture. So if you want a little bit more robust understanding, but he does cover the industrial worker rebellion very well, very thoroughly. Ultimately, though, this thesis of Zinn's that is formed throughout each chapter and then really come to head at this chapter is the idea of the establishment. So the establishment has three pillars: business executives, generals, and politicians. So, and they maintained national unity by always having a common enemy overseas, always. So one of the tactics of the establishment is war. War is an idea where it creates obedience and it silences dissent. And having a common, the friend of my enemy, the enemy of my friend is my, I forgot the saying. My mind's drawn a blank. Basically, if you have a common enemy, you're friends. I'm sure you know exactly what I'm trying to say right now. So this common enemy overseas created solidarity at home. It silenced dissent at home. This artificial unity of the highly privileged and slightly privileged, the petite bourgeoisie, as I said earlier, this artificial unity was to maintain this national unity. And more importantly was creating division. So it's not always about division when you're a politician. It's not always about unity when you're trying to when you understand politics. It's also about creating division. So what division does, and think of it this way, I always talk about like this: it's the difference between being motivated by love and motivated by fear. Fear is something Machiavelli talked about in The Prince, where it's a much better strategy for a politician. Sometimes you use love, but most of the time you use fear if you want to rule somebody, if you want to control them. And this national division, this divide and conquer strategy of the establishment was used to control the 99%. For example, here's a really good one that you probably understand today. By having the middle class pay for relief for the poor, this creates resentment. How many times do you hear someone say, I don't want to pay for that person, they're lazy, I'm not going to pay for their welfare? That's a strategy of the establishment, because a long time ago, when they paid 90% taxes in 1946, they paid for the poor. Now, what they did was they create division by having the average Joe Schmo, middle class, pay for the welfare, the assistance to the poor, which creates resentment. It's a good strategy if you think about it. The other one is the poor black and the poor white schools once they desegregated. Now this, just to send another reference. So read Crucible of Struggle by Vargas. It's a very good book. He talked about this in particular. It's a Mexican American history book. So one of the things he talked about in his book, in Vargas, and which Zinn talks about in this, is when they desegregated the schools, the rich schools were left alone because segregation remained through housing. So today you have rich neighborhoods and you have poor neighborhoods. So once they desegregated the poorer schools, that created conflict between the different races, because now you have whites, blacks, Mexicans, Asians all going to the same school, fighting for the scraps, living in overcrowded neighborhoods. And that created racial tensions and resentment. And while the rich schools remained untouched. And also, he talked about this. Another way to maintain national division is, instead of focusing on the theft of natural resources by business executives, by corporations destroying our planet, we focus on crime that is actually a result of poverty. So it's this way of like, a house of mirrors type thing. You're not really seeing the truth. So let me read you a quote. To recall this is to remind people of what the establishment would like them to forget: the enormous capacity of apparently helpless people to resist, of apparently contented people to demand change. To uncover such a history is to find a powerful human impulse to assert one's humanity. It is surprise. No, excuse me. To assert one's humanity. It is to hold out, even in times of deep pessimism, the possibility of surprise. So I think I really like this about Zinn's book. And I always tell students this too, is you have to hope for a miracle and try not to be too pessimistic in life. So, okay. One of the main goals that Zinn talks about in this book, as far as surprises go, is we have to repeat the 1930s and a lot of movements that happened. So the 1930s, 1960s, 1970s, we have to draw our history, our inspiration from history. And this is what this is my 2 cents. Half the problem is people don't know history. So how are you going to be inspired by it? So we also have to, and this is my 2 cents, we have to address our education problem and our information gap, so we know these movements. So and so Zinn states capitalism has always been a failure for the lower class, and now here's the trick, and this is one of the Zinn's really why he is so optimistic. It is now beginning to fail the middle class, the guards. So it's been called to many's attention that the middle class is now disappearing in the United States, because you need at least $150,000 to live the American dream, where you can own a home, go on vacation, get time off, etc. But now you need 2 incomes. You maybe get, I think the average American gets 2 weeks off. And so now the middle class is becoming really angry. Unemployment is spreading to white collar workers as well, professionals. A system that cannot afford a future to the young coming out of school is in deep trouble. So our colleges aren't creating, you go to college now and you still won't get ahead. That's happening. The poor are accustomed to being squeezed and always short of money. But in recent years, the middle classes too have begun to fail. The middle classes too have begun to feel the pressure of high prices and high taxes. So society is stratified by wealth and education. So good education is now one of those things that only the elite and wealthy have. Where I live, for example, if you're not going to a private school, you're not going to get a good education. I recently came up to that with my family, and so it's really getting out of reach for most people. Education in college is getting more expensive. I think the college I went to is now doubled since I went 20 years ago. So a lot of our problems, this stratification of society, is by poverty. So this has created theft. So for example, half were unemployed in a month prior to their arrest. So crime and poverty are connected. In the early 90s, excuse me. So the first edition of Zinn's book was completed in the 90s, 80s and 90s. So, and the next 2 chapters were his updated edition. So just think of it. I just want to make that clear that this chapter, which was his last chapter in the first edition, was in the 80s and 90s or 90s. Okay. Or it was about the 80s and 90s. And then the other one were after that. Okay. So let me quote this. So this is a good one. And I want to state this. So a lot of people don't understand communism in America. They think of communism as totalitarianism, authoritarianism. They think of Russia. They think of basically, they don't think of Karl Marx and know what was in the Communist Manifesto. So let me read this quote. In the early 90s, the false socialism of the Soviet system had failed, and the American system seemed out of control. A runaway capitalism a runaway technology, a runaway militarism, a runaway of government from the people it claimed to represent. At this moment in time, crime was out of control. Prices and taxes were out of control. American cities started to decay, and the breakdown of the American family, which is symbolized in the rise of alcoholics, drug use, divorce, drug abuse, mental illness, and nervous breakdown. And everyone started to sense this. So in a nutshell, the American society started to come apart at the seams. So the world, the US, is in the hands of the elite, but most histories understate the revolt. And most histories encourage impotency among its citizens, and it overemphasizes statesmanship. So let me read this first, and let me read this quote, because this is really what the chapter is about, and I want to make sure you understand what this chapter really is about. And it is hard, again, if you don't have a little bit of background on this stuff. So let me start here. They become the guards of the system. Now, and I'll explain who the guards are after this, but I want to read the quote first. They become the guards of the system, buffers between the upper and lower class. If they stop obeying, the system fails. Then another quote, we are like the guards, expendable, that the establishment, whatever rewards it gives us, will also, if necessary, to maintain control, will kill us. Now, this is one of his crazier statements. But so the guards of the rich are the soldiers, the police, the teachers, the ministers, administrators, social workers, technicians, doctors, lawyers, nurses, garbage men, firemen, everyone who is kind of in the middle. And as we stated in the last chapter, around 40 million Americans were poor in the last chapter. And so that's quite a bit. So that would be the poor, everyone else is in the middle. And then, obviously the 1% are the people at the very top. So this is one thing that he's really starting to say is the reason why he said that last real dramatic sentence was that if you don't toe the line if you get out of control, they'll kill you, because he references that the government doesn't care about you, because in Nagasaki they bombed POWs who were in Japan, Japanese prison, and the government knew about them. So basically you're expendable. That's what he's trying to say. So this growing dissatisfaction among the guards is in essence something that is encouraging to Zinn. And here's why. So this is something that recently came up with, let me just talk a little bit about just some contemporary ideas. So a lot of people believe that Donald Trump won because of this very thing I'll talk about next. And that's that the middle class whites are basically completely disillusioned at this point. They don't care. They want the whole system to come to the, drain the swamp. They want to break the establishment. They don't like elites. They don't like politicians anymore. When I say they, I'm being real general. This is how you talk in politics, by the way. I don't mean to bug you about how but when you just, let's just group all the angry middle class whites, especially along the Bible Belt and the Rust Belt. The Rust Belt is all those old industry, the decaying industry of the United States. So one of the things that Zinn mentions in here, Zinn is almost prophetic. So many people believe this is why Donald Trump won, and it was a huge surprise to many, but to a few it wasn't, because they were seeing the writing on the wall. Where, for example, in the 1950s, these middle class whites, and I use a movie by Michael Moore called Capitalism, a Love Story, because Michael Moore has a really cool description of his father. So in the 1950s, his dad worked at a Ford factory. His dad had enough money to buy a car every 3 years. His mom could stay home. He could go to New York on a summer vacation, come home, had money had expendable cash, didn't have to overwork, didn't have to work overtime. The mom could stay home. And so fast forward to the 80s and 90s, that's gone. And some would even say the middle class is basically You're either a have or a have not. There's that middle class is disappearing, and I would agree with that to some extent. So, and this is, but it's important to mention, this is something Zinn believes is actually a good thing because they're the guards of that system. So maybe that's maybe that's what I wonder what he would say about recent development. So, anyways, so here's what he talks about. Here's why the white middle class is angry, because now they're experiencing for the first time economic insecurity. They hate their jobs and their neighborhoods as well. They hate the government, and they're also breeding contempt for the lower class and racism, contempt for the elites, and this is breeding contempt for the elites. So one of the things I mentioned, just a side note, this estrangement in the middle class in the 1920s led to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. So one of the things that there's a lot of overlap in history and like Venn diagram type thing. So if you look at the second iteration, KKK 2.0, if you will, it's largely the same kind of segment of the population that was feeling some of these same feelings that Zinn talks about in the 80s and 90s. So this estrangement in the middle class led to the rise of the KKK, and it kind of, you know, in the 50s that was a good time for this portion of the population, and then now in the 80s and 90s that's gone. Okay, so I hope you followed that. Okay. So, but there is a positive way of understanding estrangement. So estrangement isn't always negative. It doesn't always lead to something negative. And one of the things it does that Zinn talked about is, and this happened on the left, by the way, not the right. So this middle class on the left, mostly white actually, because remember in the beginning of unions, it was skilled white men that were the ones that started unions, and then it started branching out with the IWW to other segments, women, minorities, unskilled. But when the unions first started, it was white men that were skilled labor. So one of the good things about this disgruntled white middle class segment that was on the left of the political spectrum was this discontent led to trade unions, farmers unions, and social movements. So there is a couple of directions you can go. This angry white middle class can go. Depends on what political spectrum you're on. Apparently it isn't. So one of the things Zinn talks about is we may have to repeat the 1930s to get where we need to be. And we'll get to his utopian vision at the very end. So capitalism has always been a failure for the lower classes. It is now beginning to fail for the middle class. Oh, I'm sorry. No, we are on the last page. Okay. I started reading over that one. Okay. So now here's the part of the book where it's like, it's pretty crazy to me because it's almost like, and I like it. So when I write, I do this too. And I encourage students too, and people, when you write, just like try to be as creative as possible. And maybe teachers don't like that. I do, because what it does is, to me, it's like you want to use the other side of your brain, the creative side. And I think that kind of, it's more it's more art than prose. And so here's Zinn's utopian vision for the future. So you want to imagine first a population based on fundamental change, where everyone has work and everyone is united. It's not just another New Deal, another reshuffling of the same deck, but is a new reconstruction of the economy without society's levers of power, giant corporations, the military, and their politician collaborators. So we need to reconstruct the economy with efficiency and justice, producing what the people need. Once these needs are met, leaving most of the time free for enjoyment, creativity, labors of love, and yet producing enough for an equal and ample distribution of goods. So what he's really saying is a redistribution of wealth. In an essence, that's what Zinn is saying. One of the main problems throughout the whole book, throughout society, is the maldistribution of wealth. So in his utopian vision, there's an ample distribution of goods for everyone. Basic things such as food, housing, healthcare, education, transportation will be taken out of the money system. So I don't know how that's going to happen, but basically um, the monetary system would be different. Definitely not. Hopefully, it's not Bitcoin. No, just joking. Um, okay, without a centralized bureaucracy, how? So this is where I'm starting to question Zinn. Like, okay, you want all these things to happen, but you need centralization to this happen. And typically, when that happens, you have corruption and so on and so forth. But his answer is this: you have decisions made by small groups of people in workplaces and neighborhoods, basically like little cooperatives, uh, being masters of their own domain. So neighborly socialism, avoiding class hierarchies of capitalism and the harsh dictatorships that have taken the name socialist. So Zinn doesn't believe the socialism of USSR, the Soviets, wasn't a real. It was a fake socialism. It wasn't true to the real socialist ideas. And socialism is an idea. So just like a lot of things, they don't. Their ideas don't always manifest in reality. So what he's saying is to really do it actually for real this time. To do all that, well, let me just say this. So I wanted to say something too to understand. This is how I understood this chapter, Utopian Vision. Is so I teach Native American history, and I write about Native American history. I write about Kumeyaay history. I have a lot of different hats, but one of the things I realized when for example, I wondered how long a Kumeyaay would work on average, and the average was 5 hours a day. So if you look at an average year, so we had a acorn harvest where maybe you work all day during the acorn harvest. It's in the autumn. It was actually in our Kumeyaay calendar. There's a season just for the acorn. I think we have 5 seasons. That one season is for the acorn harvest. But then once you have all these acorns, you're not working for weeks. Sometimes you would have fiestas, gatherings, and you would take that off. And so to me, for me to understand what the heck Zinn is saying, I have to go way back to the Stone Age. I have to go way back to the old school where we didn't have material anything except rabbit, deer, sandals, an iwa. Maybe you would have a sacred stone or a sacred object that would signify you had a certain status in society, like we had sacred rocks. But you didn't have a surplus of anything. There was, pretty much an equal distribution of goods, like kind of what Zinn is saying. So when you understand it like that, it makes more sense. Because I think now, if you were to do this idea doesn't make any sense to me. So you have to go all the way back to the Stone Age to understand what Zinn is saying, and then it makes more sense. So to do all that in the complex conditions. So here's a kind of Zinn's 2 cents about doing that now. To do all that in the complex conditions of control in the United States would require combining the energies of all previous movements in American history, of labor insurgents, Black rebels, Native Americans, women, young people, along with the new energies of an angry middle class. So the people would need to begin to transform their immediate environments, the workplace, the family, the school, the community, by a series of struggles. These struggles would involve all the tactics used at various times in the past by people's movements: demonstrations, marches, civil disobedience, strikes and boycotts, and general strikes, direct action to redistribute wealth, to reconstruct institutions, to revamp relationships, creating in music, literature, drama, all the arts, all the areas of work and play in everyday life, a new culture of sharing, of respect, a new joy in the collaboration of people to help themselves and one another. And here's where, here's kind of a cool part where he talks about is he believes this could only happen in the United States. And so this is something I thought there's not too many positives he talks about in the book. And I try to be a little more positive when I write, but everyone's different. So here's one of the more positive aspects. He talks about the United States, like how we're special and unique and what he likes about the United States. And he states this: so glimpses of this possibility happened in the 1960s and 1970s when, for the first time, the establishment failed to produce national unity and patriotic fervor in a war. This flood of cultural change happened in the sexual revolution, in the family home, in different segments of society, and in different races. This is possible because the more of the 99% that begin to see themselves as sharing needs, the more the guards and prisoners see their common interests, the more the establishment becomes isolated, ineffectual. The elite's weapons, money, control of information would be useless. All right. So that will conclude our final chapter on the series of A People's History of the United States. Thank you for watching my YouTube channel, and I hope this was helpful. Take care, everyone.